Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar brought to you by Nutrien eKonomics. My name is Michelle Allison, and I'm the Associate Publisher of Top Crop Manager. I'm joined today by Dr. Alan Blaylock, Senior Agronomist with Nutrien. Today, during our session, Alan will discuss how to optimize spring fertilizer applications, review nitrogen losses, and answer questions about spring application timing and conditions. Special thanks to our webinar sponsor, eKonomics. To quickly make sense of today's crop nutrition research and maximize your return on investment, visit nutrien-eKonomics.com. That's eKonomics with a K. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all attendees and registrants approximately 24 hours after our live broadcast. The session is scheduled to run for approximately 45 to 60 minutes. Alan will speak for about 45 minutes, and following his presentation, we'll open up the floor for questions. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them into the questions tab found on the GoToWebinar panel on your computer screen. This webinar has been approved for one CCA-CEU credit in nutrient management, and further instructions for submissions on that will follow the presentation as well. Without further ado, I will let Alan take it away from here.
Okay, thank you for joining us today. Welcome, everyone. We're going to be talking about spring nitrogen management, and we're going to cover several topics leading up to that. And included in that, we're going to discuss the nitrogen cycle, transformations of nitrogen in the soil, mechanisms for losses. These, I think, are important to understand in order to do the best job with our nitrogen. If we can better understand how nitrogen behaves in the soil, we'll be better able to pick appropriate management practices. Then we'll talk a little bit about application methods and some of the 4R nutrient management strategies, how to prevent those losses and get the most out of this important input. Our focus today is on spring application options, some of the concerns around that, some of the options that growers may have, and which of those may work better in certain circumstances. We recognize that there's a fairly diverse audience on the webinar today, so we'll try to make some distinctions between some of the prairie applications and situations and some of the somewhat different situations for more humid regions, high rainfall regions. I realize we have people from wheat production systems as well as corn production systems and maybe some others. So we'll try to make some distinctions between those systems when it comes to specific recommendations, but if there's something we don't cover, certainly you can submit questions on that. So some of it will be somewhat general. Again, these principles can be applied in a variety of situations, so hopefully understanding the principles will help you make better decisions. So there's obviously a great deal to know about the nitrogen cycle and all the different things that can happen in the field. It's very complex. There are many processes going on, but a few of the basics to keep in mind. Most of the nitrogen in the soil is in an organic form. It's not available to plants. Some of that becomes available over the growing season through biological processes. We also know that plants take up ammonium and nitrate forms, and so those are two of the forms that we're most interested in for our discussion today. Their behavior influences the various loss mechanisms as well as the amount of nitrogen that gets into the plant. Now, the ammonium and nitrate forms are somewhat different in their nature and behavior. Ammonium is held on negative charges on soil clays and organic matter. We consider it to be less mobile in the soil. It is retained on the solid fraction, where nitrate is in the soil solution. It's highly mobile. It moves with soil water. It's taken up very rapidly by the plant. We need some nitrate for maximum plant availability during periods of rapid growth. And both of these sources are important to us. Nitrogen transformations can occur very rapidly in the soil. In the spring and early summer, when the soil is warming, biological organisms are becoming very active, and these are responsible for those transformations. So we can have a change in the nitrogen form in a very short period that can affect how nitrogen behaves and the performance of our fertilizers. And most importantly, and we'll talk a fair bit about this last point today, nitrogen performance is highly related to weather conditions. And we all know that weather is unpredictable. Our climatologists tell us the weather is becoming more unpredictable. We're getting more of the rainfall in large rainfall events, and these rainfall events tend to be major drivers of nitrogen loss. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind as well. We're trying to manage risk with something that is unpredictable and sometimes unreliable. So keep that in the back of your mind through this discussion. So here's a representation of the nitrogen cycle. We're not going to talk about all aspects of this today. You can study this in many different places. You can read about it online or in textbooks, but we're going to focus specifically on the different loss mechanisms. So these items marked in red, volatilization, denitrification, and leaching, are important losses from the soil. Those losses can have environmental impacts, but most importantly for producers in many cases, is there an economic impact? Every pound of nitrogen that leaves the soil by one of these mechanisms, even crop harvest or runoff, is an investment that you paid for that didn't help produce the crop. Now, crop harvest is actually what we want to achieve, but these other losses are undesirable because that's nitrogen that didn't help us grow a crop. So we're going to focus much of our discussion on those mechanisms and how to prevent them. All right, so let's review those losses briefly. Leaching is the loss of nitrate nitrogen by downward water movement. So when we have rainfall or irrigation that exceeds the ability of the soil to store the water, that water can move downward if the soil is permeable. And because nitrate is dissolved in the soil solution, it goes with the water, at least some portion of it. Denitrification also occurs from the nitrate form, but occurs under a different set of conditions, where leaching is common in permeable soils, well-drained soils. Denitrification occurs when the soil becomes saturated or nearly saturated and oxygen becomes deficient, and certain organisms take that nitrate and strip the oxygen off of that nitrate form, in the process changing nitrate to one of several gases that can then escape from the soil. So this occurs when the soil becomes ponded, when we have excess rainfall that is not drained freely from the soil. So somewhat a different set of conditions than where we experience leaching. Both are driven by excess moisture, but occur under different soil conditions. Volatilization, or as we say in Canadian, volatilization, is a loss of ammonia gas. It occurs primarily from the surface application of urea forms of nitrogen, but could also occur from improper application of anhydrous ammonia. We'll discuss these losses in some more detail. Immobilization is a temporary loss. This is a term we use for the conversion of inorganic forms of nitrogen to organic forms. For example, when we have crop residues remaining, the organisms that decompose those residues need a source of nitrogen, and they will use these inorganic forms to function, to complete that decomposition. So in essence, they're competing with the crop plants. Now, this is not a permanent loss, it's temporary, and that nitrogen can become available again during the growing season as those residues are decomposed. Crop uptake is the desirable outcome. We're talking about the nitrogen removed in the harvested portion. In wheat, for example, the protein that is in the grain is a nitrogen compound. And so when we're considering our nitrogen budgets, that may be something to include there, and it helps us understand where the nitrogen is going. That's really the desired outcome because humans need to eat proteins, and when we're consuming those food crops, that's a component, and nitrogen is a key element there. All right, so to summarize these nitrogen losses, I like to look at it as two basic nitrogen risks. We have a short-term risk that occurs when we apply urea on the soil surface if it's not incorporated. That urea converts very quickly to ammonium or ammonia. If that is on the surface and it's not trapped within the soil, then some of that ammonia gas can escape. This is a loss that occurs really within a few days after application. It's perhaps in some ways more readily manageable. It's again over a short period of time, and once that urea is converted, then the potential for that loss disappears. The other major risk is a season-long risk, and this is the risk of losses that can occur from the nitrate form really at any time during the season if conditions occur that contribute to either leaching or denitrification. So as long as that nitrate is in the soil, which we kind of need for the crop, we can have the risk of that nitrate loss. And it's associated, as I said, with rainfall and irrigation events that are in excess of what the crop needs or in excess of the soil's ability to store that moisture. So as we look at these two different loss mechanisms, we can begin to think about how we might manage those losses. In one case, looking at managing a specific fertilizer application. In another case, looking at a season-long nitrogen management strategy. Okay, so let's talk about some of the conditions that favor these losses. Leaching, most people are familiar with this. Again, it's related to the nitrate form of nitrogen because that's highly mobile in the soil. If we have excess rain or irrigation beyond what the soil can hold or beyond what the crop is able to use, then that water moves on through the soil if soil permeability allows that and carries some of the nitrate with us. Now, we should also recognize that during, for example, the middle of the summer when corn is growing rapidly, the weather is warm, corn is using lots of water, it's also using lots of nitrogen. Loss by leaching should be less because the crop is competing for that nitrogen. During seasons of minimal crop uptake or in conditions where the soil is already filled with water, it doesn't take much rain to move that nitrogen beyond the root zone. Soil drainage is a factor. So particularly in sandy soils or where well-structured soils where water flows through the soil profile very readily, those are conditions most prone to leaching losses. Soils with greater water holding capacity that will store more water are less prone to leaching losses. And all of this adds up to nitrate movement below the rooting zone. Some nitrate movement is not necessarily a problem, but if it gets beyond the crop rooting depth, then it's no longer available, and then we consider that loss to the crop. And generally speaking, the potential for leaching loss increases as we go from west to east. In our prairies and Great Plains of the United States, where rainfall is relatively low, leaching potential is lower, and leaching losses are actually not particularly common. As we move east into the higher rainfall regions, the eastern edges of the prairies on into Ontario and in the Corn Belt in the U.S. and onto the East Coast, leaching potential increases dramatically as the rainfall is much greater. And the same could be said for our denitrification potential, although that may be perhaps more related to specific soil areas and soil properties. So let's talk about denitrification now. This, as I said, is related to wet soil. So when oxygen becomes deficient, this is when we have the greatest potential for denitrification. It increases with increasing soil temperature. Where the actual leaching event is really unrelated to temperature, denitrification is very much related to temperature. The bacteria, the organisms that convert nitrate nitrogen to those gases become much more active as soil temperatures increase. And a 20-degree increase in soil temperature can actually triple the rate of denitrification. So in warm soils, we can have very rapid losses. It increases with the crop residue amount. The crop residue is food for those denitrifying organisms. So when we have more carbon source in the soil, that carbon source is the energy source for the bacteria. It stimulates them to greater activity. And compaction can also be a factor. Compaction reduces the air-filled pore space, causes the soil to retain more water. As the soil fills up with water, then we increase the potential for that loss. So any of these conditions, and particularly combinations of these conditions, lead to greater denitrification potential. So one of the key factors in leaching and denitrification is the rate of conversion from ammonium forms or organic forms to nitrate. So when we apply an ammonium fertilizer to the soil, the bacteria begin to start to convert that to nitrate. And as you can see in this table, when the soil is very cold, near freezing, that conversion takes a long time. It's not zero, but that conversion is very much slower. At 20 degrees, you can see we can convert 50% of the ammonium to nitrate in as little as 10 days or maybe even faster. And if the temperature is 25 degrees, that time becomes as little as a few days. So this becomes important in terms of fertilizer management and how and when we want to apply the fertilizer in relation to the potential conversions and potential loss events that could occur. If our fertilizer converts to nitrate very quickly and we have a loss event soon after that, then we have high potential for loss. So it's important to understand the nitrification cycle. All right, so managing these losses, our goal should be to minimize the soil nitrate because these leaching and denitrification losses are occurring from the nitrate form. We want to try to manage the amount of nitrate in the soil when there's a potential for those loss events. Now, this becomes kind of tricky because we need to have nitrate there to feed the plants, to maximize our yield for best crop performance. We need to have that nitrate there. What we're trying to do is not have more than the crop needs at that time. So we want, in other words, we want to time the nitrogen to match crop demand and reduce risk, so that we only have what's needed and not excess. What this usually translates to is making multiple applications in these soils, in these conditions where those losses could occur. If we're farming on a sandy soil, we'll probably need several applications, and oftentimes even 2 applications may not give us sufficient protection. Or poorly drained soils where water tends to pond, we tend to have higher denitrification rates. we may want to consider applying nitrogen in 2 or more applications during the season so as to reduce the amount of nitrate in the soil at any point in time. Another option is to use fertilizer technology, either control release fertilizers that release nitrogen over a period of time, or nitrification inhibitors that slow the conversion from ammonium to nitrate. So these materials have been shown to reduce those leaching and denitrification losses because they help us control the amount of soil nitrate that's present at a point in time when those loss events could be occurring. So let's talk a little bit about volatilization. This occurs, as we said, from surface applied urea during the transformation of urea to ammonium. If it's on the surface, this ammonia gas can escape into the air. There's an enzyme in the soil called urease, and it's very abundant in nature. It occurs virtually everywhere. It's not limiting, and when the urea comes in contact with this enzyme, it begins to convert. If this conversion occurs at the soil surface, or even with shallow incorporation, some of the ammonia can escape. Moist soil, so we need to have some moisture for this process to start. And in a dry soil, we don't have that urea conversion. But when we have moisture present to dissolve the urea fertilizer, then that conversion is very rapid. Warm temperatures. The rate of conversion generally increases as temperature increases, but we have seen in recent research in the northern plains in the U.S. that volatilization losses can be significant even in cold soils during the winter. So leaving urea on the soil surface is a risk regardless of the time of year. Wind, it can be a factor. If we have wind, that disperses the ammonia faster, and so losses occur more rapidly. One of the keys is insufficient rainfall after application. If the urea is not incorporated into the soil in some way, then the ammonia is not contained. If we get sufficient rainfall to move urea into the soil within a short period after application, typically 24 to 36 hours, 24 to 48 hours, if we get at least a half an inch of rain within that time after application, then the urea is pushed into the soil, generally to a depth where the ammonia would be trapped and volatilization would be limited. If we don't get that rain and we get just enough rain to dissolve the urea fertilizer, but not enough to move it into the soil, then that would be prime conditions for losses. Of course, we can also mechanically incorporate the urea as well. But generally, if we're surface applying urea, it's in a situation where perhaps we don't have that opportunity. High soil pH is a key factor. As soil pH increases, the equilibrium shifts from ammonium ions to ammonia gas. And that means more gas would be driven off, more gas would escape. So if we're in soil pHs of greater than 7, the potential for ammonia loss is greater. The potential for volatilization is greater. In acid soils, the potential is reduced. And then also sandy or low cannon exchange soils. Sandy soils have less capacity to absorb the ammonium, and therefore less of it is trapped and more potential for ammonia to be lost into the air. So these are some of the factors. There are obviously others. As you can see, it can be somewhat complex, but the key to reducing volatilization is to get urea into the soil rather than leaving it on the surface. So again, our goal here would be to manage the time of exposure of urea. If we're applying urea on the soil surface, we want to try to get it into the soil as quickly as possible, either with mechanical incorporation or by rainfall. One option is to band UAN solution instead of broadcast. It's more concentrated, less surface area exposed, Generally, banding, even if it's on the surface, tends to reduce volatilization potential. Most of the research shows that if we can get at least a half an inch of rain within 24 to 36 hours, we can minimize volatilization. So a key recommendation is to watch the weather forecast. Now, obviously, that rainfall is unpredictable, but 1 to 2 day forecasts are generally somewhat reliable, though not completely reliable. But if there's a significant rainfall in the imminent forecast, then that would be a good time to apply urea. We may not always be able to do that. We can also use less volatile sources. For example, ammonium sulfate is generally not volatile. At high soil pH, we could lose ammonia from ammonium sulfate, but because it's an acidic material and it doesn't go through that conversion process of urea, generally volatilization from that source would be much less. Ammonium nitrate, which in most markets is no longer available, is generally considered a non-volatile source. Other nitrate sources, calcium nitrate, are also non-volatile materials. Now, recognizing those are less commonly available, they're more expensive, so you have to weigh that cost against the potential loss from volatilization. And another option is if we're going to be applying urea on the surface, we don't have a reliable forecast of rain, but we have to get the nitrogen out there. Sometimes we can't wait for that rain. Sometimes we could wait for weeks and the rain doesn't come. So that's obviously a different kind of risk. But another option is to use urease inhibitors with that urea that's going to be surface applied. If we know we're going to apply urea or UAN solutions that contain urea on the soil surface and we're not going to be incorporating, it's typically advisable to use a urease inhibitor with to treat that urea or UAN. In that way, we can greatly reduce those losses. It gives us some additional time to get rain or mechanical incorporation to get it into the soil. Basically, the inhibitors slow the conversion down, the conversion of urea to ammonia, and therefore reduce the loss. So that's generally a good practice. Okay, so let's talk about some of the spring management decisions that we might be facing and some possibilities. This is from the Alberta Agriculture Nitrogen Management Guidelines. And it's basically a summary of lots of data that's been collected in the prairies and giving some typical relative performance values for spring and fall applications broadcast and banded in some of the different environments. So in this table, the spring broadcast and incorporated application is given a rating of 100%, and then the other applications are compared to that. So for example, in dry soils, we can make the comparison between spring broadcast and spring banded, and we see a 20% improvement in performance by banding the nitrogen rather than broadcasting and incorporated. If we look at fall broadcast, it's not even as good as spring, so its performance is about 10% worse than spring broadcast. But in this case, in a drier environment, fall banding may be as good as spring banding. So when we're in low rainfall areas and the risk of loss is relatively low, fall banding may be an acceptable practice. In much of the prairies, Alberta and Saskatchewan, the northern Great Plains in the U.S., fall banding is an excellent practice for our cereal and canola rotations, tends to perform very well. But as you see, as we move from dry environments to wetter environments, particularly that fall application declines in performance. So in wet environments, certainly you can see why fall application would not be recommended, particularly as a broadcast. It's better if you have to apply in the fall. A band certainly looks quite a bit better than broadcasting, but still not as good as applying in the spring. So we can compare some of these different applications. In the wetter environments, the spring broadcast or the spring band is still better than the broadcast. We'll look at a specific example of that here in a minute or two. And under irrigated conditions, we see similar differences. So generally speaking, basically what this is saying is the further in advance of the crop nitrogen need that we're applying the fertilizer, the greater the risk. So we can connect the application timing to the risk potential, and the greater the time in between the application and crop uptake, the greater the risk of something undesirable happening, a leaching event, a denitrification event, volatilization, or all of these losses. So the closer we can apply to the time of crop need, generally, the greater the performance, the more efficient the nitrogen use. Now, in any case, we have to weigh the efficiency of the application against our ability to get the work done. Sometimes it's not feasible to band nitrogen in the spring before we plant our crop, or we may not have equipment to mount on our planter to make that application. In recent years, we've had very compressed spring seasons. We've been delayed by weather events, and so you simply run out of time. And then what do? We may be forced into making a broadcast application. We're going to talk about some of the things that we might be able to do if that happens. But the data is fairly clear that band applications would be preferred to broadcast when possible, and spring applications would be preferred over fall applications in most cases. So given that context, we can look at the recommendations. All right, I'm going to show you some data from a recent corn study in Minnesota. Dr. Fernandez there in the University of Minnesota has been doing a lot of studies with different nitrogen placements and sources and timing. In this particular study, we have some good comparisons between fall and spring. We have placements in a band versus broadcast. We have treatments with and without inhibitors. So there's some interesting comparisons here. So just looking first at the overall average, in this case, again, our spring application is better. About a 14 bushel difference in corn yield between spring and fall applications. So you can see why that might be preferred in this environment. If we look then at the source differences, simply averaging fall versus spring, the ammonia with N-Serve, and recognizing that the spring application, ammonia application actually did not use N-Serve, but if we look at ammonia, we have ESN, a control release fertilizer, urea, and urea plus a nitrification inhibitor. In this case, the nitrification inhibitor, when averaged over the times and placements, didn't really provide an advantage, although you'll see when we break this down, you'll see some specific differences. Again, ammonia is an excellent fertilizer, and in this case, the controlled release source produced superior yields to the urea. But let's go to the actual individual treatments and break those down a bit. So you can see the ammonia is really the same spring or fall in this particular environment. A fairly large improvement from fall to spring with the ESN treatment. And particularly if we look at the placement averages, the band treatments, so averaging all of the banded treatments together, excluding the ammonia actually, averaging all the banded urea treatments together, we're still about 9 bushels better than that broadcast and incorporated application. And I suspect if we had a surface broadcast here, that it would probably not be quite as good as the broadcast and incorporated because of potential volatilization. But looking specifically at some of these treatments, we see how much difference in the fall application there was from banding the urea. For that fall timing, the banding was very important in conserving nitrogen. When we put the inhibitor with it, there's a little bit of improvement. But if we compare the band with the inhibitor to band without the inhibitor, not a lot of difference there. If we look at the spring applications, the banded urea treatment shows a significant improvement over a broadcast treatment. And again, with the inhibitor, there's a little bit of difference there in the spring, but not as much as in the fall. So spring banding looks to be a very efficient treatment in this case. And interesting to note, there is not a banded treatment of the ESN in this particular study, but based on some other research that has been done, the difference between a broadcast ESN and a band ESN would look similar to the difference between broadcast and banded urea. So perhaps if we had a banded ESN treatment, it might be even better than this broadcast treatment, but that's speculation based on other research. But nonetheless, you can see how the spring band, again, even in this corn production system, it would still be the preferred application where that's possible. Now, I recognize a lot of producers don't have equipment to band dry fertilizer. They may be able to band liquid, however, and similar advantages would exist for banding liquid materials, but banding seems to be the preferred way to go. I've done in previous research of my own when I was with the university system, I did some studies with banding, and we virtually always got better results with banding. And so I personally am an advocate of banded placement where that's possible, but recognizing that it's not always possible. We may not have the time or equipment. Banding, particularly subsurface banding, is a more expensive application. It requires different equipment. So we have to work with the constraints that we have, but where possible, that would be my preference. So let's talk about some of the 4R type of factors in our application. We need to consider the yield goal. Now, understanding that yield goal is not always a good predictor of end need, but particularly in our dryland cropping systems, we can look at stored soil moisture that can help us make a decision in how much nitrogen we need. Looking at yield history, are we able to plant on time? Because that certainly influences our yield goal. If we're planting late and we're expecting that could reduce yields, we may not need as much nitrogen. We want to look ahead, anticipate what kind of growing conditions we might have based on what we know at the time we're making those decisions. And then perhaps we can make in-season adjustments. So yield goal is certainly something to consider when we're thinking about the rate to apply. When we look at placement, again, as we said, spring banding would be preferred. In the Western Canadian research, generally there's been little or no difference among the nitrogen sources when they're banded, but there could be differences due to timing. Again, as I said, recognizing pre-plant banding may be time-consuming, particularly if we're needing to inject ammonia. That's we can't cover as many acres in a day. And if we're rushed by late rainstorms and it shortened our spring season and compressed our workload into a shorter time, that may not be possible. Also recognizing, particularly in dryland systems where moisture is limited, the banding may cause more seed disturbance and greater loss of soil moisture because we're opening the soil up. So there we might consider banding with the planter, either a seed placed application or mid-row or side-row banding with our seeders to save operations, save time, save traffic over the field, and reduce soil disturbance. Seed row placement is popular for the cereal and canola production systems, but we need to recognize there are safe limits. The safety varies with row spacing openers, seedbed utilization, and soil properties. There are a variety of resources where you can find these tables. I've listed a couple here, but you can easily Google safe rates for seed placement or something like that and find these same sources. I'd give you one example here. This is from Alberta Agriculture, providing some safe rates, and this is the kind of information that you can find and give you guidance based on the type of equipment you have, the type of soil properties, particularly soil texture, and make a decision as to what's safe. Another option, if you're going to be seed placing, is the ESN, because it's control release, it has a significantly greater safety factor. You could put more nitrogen in the seed row with that. All right, so let's talk about placement. Again, some of the same factors we've talked about. One of the advantages of placing it below the surface is the reduced risk of runoff, reduced risk of volatilization, and particularly in dryland systems where we have limited rainfall, reduce stranding of that nitrogen, put it in the seed zone, in the root zone where the plant can get it. We talked about broadcasting when rain is imminent to reduce the potential for volatilization and to consider urease inhibitors. So if we're going to be surface placing the fertilizer, we need to recognize some of these risks, but consider the advantages as well. And we'll talk a little bit about split applications, and then we'll kind of summarize all of this and give you time for questions. In many environments, particularly in wetter environments, split applications can be a risk management tool. If we know we have the potential for wetness, high rainfall, or ponding of soils, then it may be preferable to apply part of our nitrogen pre-plant to get the crop started and then come back and apply the rest of the nitrogen later on. That does several things for us, reduces the risk of having nitrogen just sitting in the soil when the crop's not using it, gets that nitrogen in the ground closer to plant demand. In dry conditions, it may give us the opportunity to apply some of the nitrogen at planting or before planting based on the amount of stored soil moisture, and then wait and see what kind of rainfall we get. If conditions improve, we could come back and apply some additional nitrogen. But recognize that those later applications, those post-emergent top dress applications, do have risks of volatilization, stranding in dry conditions, greater risk of runoff. In the case of wheat, they may actually be beneficial to enhance grain protein. So it's a variety of things to consider there, the type of crop and the environment we're growing in, potential for loss mechanisms. All right, so let's wrap this up by summarizing some of our 4R concepts. There are some key scientific principles that are behind this: ensuring balanced nutrient supply, assessing all our different sources of nutrients from soil to potentially irrigation water, organic amendments that may have been applied, placing nitrogen in the root system according to the type of crop that we have, and timing it to meet crop demand. The kinds of practical decisions that leads to are the type of fertilizer. Are we soil testing to know what's available, calculating economic returns, thinking about when that nitrogen may be most needed. In any event, we need to have the nitrogen there by the time the yield potential is determined, and then considering placement according to the type of material we have, the type of equipment, and potential losses, so that we know how to best manage that to prevent or reduce those losses. So with that, I would like to say that one thing that's ultimately important is that the results are going to depend on matching appropriate practices to the loss mechanisms that we have, the soil properties and weather conditions, and the desired outcomes that we're after. These would be the things that would be key to our success. reducing exposure of susceptible forms such as nitrate exposure to leaching or to denitrification, or urea exposure to volatilization, and then to increase nutrient use efficiency, matching the supply to crop demand, and all of these things result in greater yields and profits and reduced environmental impact. So with that, I think we'll stop the presentation and we'll hand it back to you, Michelle, for any questions.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Alan, for the presentation. That was really great. So we've got a few questions. I'm going to start with one that came in live during the presentation from Gary. He's thinking of some spring applied fertilizer in winter wheat and looking for your recommendation in how to incorporate the fertilizer and what your opinion is for that.
Yeah, great question. So if we're talking about spring applied fertilizer on winter wheat, a couple of things are going to be important. Recognizing one, that wheat nitrogen demand is fairly early in the season. So we need to make sure, and yield potential is established early in the season also by the number of tillers, and the size of the heads are determined very early in its growth. So we need to make sure that we get the nitrogen on early enough to make sure it's there when those tillers and head size are being determined. So we don't want to be too late, and we don't want to be applying nitrogen into the jointing period unless we're considering making an additional application for protein enhancement, which might be applied later on. But the key is to get the nitrogen on as early as we can. So typically that's applied just about the time the wheat is coming out of dormancy and starting to grow. That's an ideal time to make that application. Did that adequately answer that?
I think so, Gary. Just let us know if you have any other questions regarding that. A few questions from our registration panel. Can you touch on anhydrous in the spring before seeding canola?
Yeah, anhydrous application is in the spring is obviously an excellent fertilization practice if we can get it done. In the spring, one of our greatest limitations with ammonia, a couple of limitations. One is going to be soil moisture is going to be a factor in our ability to apply the nitrogen properly. If the soil is too wet and the ammonia injector smears the soil and the slot doesn't close, then some of the ammonia can be lost. Or if the soil is too dry and there's not enough moisture to trap the ammonia, then again we can have some loss. So soil moisture needs to be at an optimum to do a good job of that application. The other limitation in the spring is often time. As I mentioned, particularly when we have late springs with adverse weather conditions, the time to make the application may be limited and ammonia application does take longer. If, however, we can make the application, apply ammonia, and do it properly, it's a great way to fertilize. Ammonia is a great fertilizer. It's very economical. There's certainly the safety concerns, and everyone's aware of those. But if ammonia application pre-plant is not possible because of some of the constraints we've named, then you may want to consider switching to side row or mid-row banding with a dry fertilizer or liquid as an alternative that may save some time.
Great, thank you. Cam online here is asking, when is yield determination for canola for the post application?
Yeah, so yield of canola is also determined fairly early. If you study the crops, most crops, the yield potential is determined fairly early, and then the plant is forming those flower parts when it's still very small. The cells that are going to become flowers form quite early. So that's beginning to happen in the rosette stage with canola, and as that stem elongates, then The next stage of yield development is flowering, and so the number of flowers that actually get pollinated and turn into seed, and then the third component would be seed size. So seed size is determined during the pod fill period. So each of those three stages, early on during the vegetative growth when the maximum number of flowers is determined, then during the flowering process, any stresses that occur at that time could reduce the number of flowers that get pollinated and become seeds. And then, as I said, the seed size during pod fill. So each of those stages is important, but often in our dryland systems, either with wheat or canola, that initial determination of the potential maximum number of flowers is a critical determinant of yield. So we, in terms of nutrient management, we want to make sure that we have our nitrogen and phosphorus down before that happens.
Great, thanks. Another question online here. If applying 20% N on no-till seeded winter wheat early in the spring using streamer nozzles, how much loss might be expected if soils become saturated or if the weather warms up?
So the amount of loss that could occur, now typically that streaming UAN on winter wheat is usually a pretty good application. If, however, the soil becomes saturated for, say, several days or up to a week, those losses can be 30 or 40% if that saturation remains for a period of time. If it's a short-term saturation and the conditions are warm and conducive to that loss, then it could occur, but for only a day or two, it's probably going to be much less. But if it persists for 4 or 5 days or even a week, those losses can be as much as 40, sometimes 50%, although I would say that's quite rare. I've seen losses like that in saturated cornfields, but typically in our dryland wheat, we don't have such severe conditions, but that stream bar or stream band type of application is usually pretty effective.
Okay. I'm going to jump back to Gary. He's just asking, what do you think about using the rotary hoe to incorporate that spring application in winter wheat?
My personal preference I'd prefer not to disturb the wheat because every one of any potential tillers you may take out, that's going to be lost yield. I'd probably rather use a urease inhibitor than disturb that wheat coming up in the spring. That would be my preference. I can't say that I've seen any studies on that particular practice using a rotary hoe or some kind of harrow on the wheat to incorporate it. I haven't seen any studies done on that, but I would prefer to avoid disturbing the wheat. I think there'd be more gain from using a stabilizer or something to prevent the loss than to try to physically incorporate it at that stage.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. We've got one here for the organic growers. Do you have any further suggestions on nitrogen placement for organic growers? And according to your experience and knowledge, what source is best when it comes to sourcing organic nitrogen fertilizers?
That's a tough question. There are a variety of organic sources, and they're typically going to, the most commonly used ones are going to be manures and compost, probably the most readily available. Those are certainly excellent sources. One of the advantages is the addition of additional organic material. That certainly is good for the soil. As far as incorporation, the incorporation methods would be similar to with a commercial fertilizer. One of the things to remember with organic sources, and it's both a positive and a challenge, one of the benefits of organic sources is they behave as slow-release fertilizers, so they supply nutrients over a period of time as they decompose. The disadvantage is that can be somewhat unpredictable, and so it may be more difficult to match nutrient supply to crop demand. The nutrients as they're released from the organic material, as that mineralizes with biological activity, those forms of nitrogen then become susceptible to the same transformations and loss mechanisms that a fertilizer would be susceptible to. The advantage being that, as I said, they function as a slow release fertilizer and reduce risk by releasing the nutrients over a period of time.
Okay, for sure. One last question here from the registration page. How much mineralization occurs between fall soil sampling and spring nutrient application, and how do we manage that?
So this question gets the agronomist's favorite answer. It depends. So it's a really hard question to answer. There's been a great deal of study on that. The research results are mixed, widely varying results. The tie-up from mineralization is kind of an unknown. Maybe the question is more about how much nitrogen do we need to apply to compensate for that, and we can calculate that based on some mass balance and come up with some numbers. About 40 pounds of nitrogen per ton of residue, say for corn stalks, or wheat straw would be immobilized, but we can't really apply that amount for every ton of residue. We get some really ridiculous nitrogen application rates. We might be, if we're strictly applying according to the amount of residue there, we could get to 300 or 400 pounds of nitrogen, which we know is far in excess and not practical or economical. But to apply a small amount on the residue to help stimulate the bacteria, say 40 or 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre to get that process started, may be beneficial, although, as I said, the results on that are somewhat mixed. Some studies showing a benefit, other studies showing no difference. So it's kind of hard to give an exact answer to that, but I know many growers like to do that and find that beneficial. But we want to probably be conservative and not over apply, recognizing that once that process starts, that nitrogen is going to become available again, and priming the decomposition could be beneficial in getting that process going faster.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Folks, if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to Alan via email at alan.blaylock@nutrien.com. His email is right on the screen there if you have any questions. And before we end today, just a reminder that this webinar has been approved for 1 CCA-CEU nutrient management credit. If you did not submit your certification number when registering, please email your first and last name and CCA number to webinars@annexbusinessmedia.com. And these instructions will be found in our follow-up email as well, which will have a recording of the webinar. Again, thank you very much, Alan, for your presentation. It was really great, and we had great engagement today, so thank you to all of our attendees. And don't forget to visit topcropmanager.com/webinars to view all of our past and upcoming webinars. And one last special thanks to our webinar sponsor, eKonomics. To quickly make sense of today's crop nutrition research and maximize your return on investment, visit nutrien-economics.com. That's economics with a K. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.